Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you?
Okay, good morning, Frank. Since we talked last, I think the news has been taken up with more and more activities relating to the possibility of a war along the southern border of the United States, and whether or not or how the United Kingdom might leave the European Union.
Mhm.
And there's also been other things going on in the world that have to do with the survival of the nation state as what is at the moment really the only way we have of organizing the global community.
Mhm.
It's really quite amazing that even though everybody takes the nation state for granted now, even though most states aren't nations, even though the governments generally pretend they are. And this is, of course, especially the case with the states that are the survival of the colonial period, and especially throughout Africa. In fact, the idea of the nation state only began as a result of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And we may have said this before, but it took a long time for this problem of the relationship between the interpretation of Christianity and the rights of each political authority in Europe to turn into what came to be known as the nation state. And then, of course, soon after that, people stopped going to church, or began to stop going to church. And now we've got up until, 100 years ago, or even less than that, maybe 50 years ago, it was assumed that the odd people on your street were the people who didn't go to church.
Right.
And even though freedom of religion had been introduced in the 19th century, and a lot of people didn't go to the established church of your state, nevertheless, they still expected you to go to church, and they did make some, there was some recognition all the time of the established religion. And now religion has really become irrelevant to identity, except among people, perhaps a minority, who still consider it very important. But I think it's definitely a minority, and a smaller minority in Europe than it is in the United States. And it never became the main way of thinking about identity in other parts of the world, or at least not to the same extent. So we've asked before this question of just exactly what is going to, how on earth is a global community going to be organized? And if it can't be organized in terms of collections of nation states, then where do we start? And a lot of people, I'm sure, still think that it can be organized in terms of collections of nation states. However, since the middle of the last century, people have started moving around much more, so that several nation states have begun to spend a lot of time trying to actively defend their borders. But in each case, it's not really a majority. So the big question in the United States is just how many people want a wall, and how do they think about it, and do they want to pay for it? And in the United Kingdom, it's only about half the people who voted to leave the European Union. But in each case, it has to do with the maintenance of sovereignty, the maintenance of political freedom in terms of a national community.
Well, let me just jump in a second, right? It occurs to me that we often give short shrift to religion as being a marker for identity for all people. I mean, if we look at what's going on with the Rohingya for example, in Asia. If we look what's going on throughout Europe with the Muslims. And it occurred to me as you were talking that there might be a dirtier, more obscene, more foul kind of delineation here. And it may fall along the lines of people who look like us, act like us, are culturally similar to us, are all right. People who are of a different color, who are browner, or do not speak our language, are not all right. It almost may be as simple as that, because when we talk about the wall in the United States, I mean, there's no talk of a wall on the northern border. The wall is always on the southern border. When the president meets with the prime ministers of Nordic countries, he invites them to send their people to our country. And it just seems to me that it's time to begin to call this for what it is. It's a kind of a fear-based response that a vast majority of people in England with the anti-immigration, in the United States and elsewhere have, about people who do not look like them, who are not identical to them, and are not the same as they are. They're afraid of them. And this is really at the heart of the anti-globalization discussion we've always been having. If people were more open to globalization and what it can bring and benefit them, they wouldn't fear it. They wouldn't be narrowly identifying the world through this kind of a prism. Oh, if they don't look like me and act like me, they're bad. I mean, we're back to where we were 10,000 years ago now.
Well, that certainly is the history of it. But I thought, I can't remember the actual details now, but there have been changes in the border control regulations on the northern border of the United States, between the United States and Canada. It's not so easy to cross the border into Canada now as it was 50 years ago or 30 years ago.
It may not be easier. That's correct, but there's an awful lot of unguarded border up there. Yeah, believe me.
Well, in between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the border's not marked.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of concern about the border. But there it's a very different problem, because it was the British who drew the border in the 1890s.
Curzon.
And the Pashtuns, who had launched the idea of a state of Afghanistan with a new empire in the middle of the 18th century. Half of them live in what is now Afghanistan, and half of them live in what is now Pakistan.
Right.
And they're very upset about the situation. But because of the problems between Pakistan and India, it's a very complicated situation. Anyway, I wonder what this is going to mean for the future of the nation state, because it seems to me that whereas it was taken absolutely for granted 50 years ago, now nation states are having to defend the idea of being what they think they are.
That's right.
And it's funny that, well, I shouldn't say funny, it's to some extent ironic that the state that seems to be most concerned about that is America, the United States of America, which is in fact a country based on immigration, which is now trying to prevent immigration. And it was only at a certain stage in the formation of the current population of the United States through immigration that the identity of the people here began to be more important than the identity of the people who wanted to come here.
Well, and that's true, and that's where we are now. And I mean that's I think one of the main reasons that the British were able to the forces in England that were pro exiting the European Union. I think that's what carried them over the top in being able to convince people. It was the immigration issue. And it's not a healthy dynamic if you're able to convince people to do things that are really against their financial interest simply by playing to their biases and fear. That's not good.
Well, I mean, it's only 150 years ago or so since we gave up the idea that we're perhaps not all a single species and we're biologically different. And then it's only 50 years ago, really, that we enforced that idea legally and began to think that it's the culture that is more important than race. And people in each nation state have a different cultural identity. They behave differently. They speak a different language. They have different understandings of various things. But if we're going to become a global community, those cultural boundaries are gradually going to fade. So it's going to be interesting to see whether, as the cultural boundaries fade more and more, because at the moment they're fading among the people who travel a lot and not so much among the people who don't travel a lot. And one of the reasons that the United States has this problem is that Americans tend not to travel very much. I think we've said before that only 30% of Americans apparently have passports, and most of them, when they do travel outside the United States, they stay in American hotels rather than actually getting to know the rest of the world.
Right, right.
For this reason, it's very difficult to understand how anything else is going, well, what possibly could arise that would take the place of the nation state in a global community. Because there's going to be tremendous opposition to the idea of a government that is somehow formed by other people being in charge of your administration.
Well, I think that would be a useful line of thought to examine, because it's clear to me, I think, that the nation state is not going to be able to adapt quickly enough to maintain. It's only going to fade in relevance, which means that something will replace it. And I think that's what we have to begin to think about, is what's going to be more palatable to the greater mass of people to supplant the nation state.
And do you think we'll have a government in the United States again sometime?
We may not. We may not.
Well, presumably there'll be an election here in 2020. So.
Oh, there will be an election. Yeah. I mean, we've always danced around the absurdity of this. About the science fiction writers like Ray Bradbury have written about it a generation ago. There's this conflation and confluence of media with government and politics, and this is what's happening now, and people living vicariously through mediums that Ray Bradbury couldn't even have known about, for example. And it's going to call for a reassessment, I think, as to the way things are going to be, because they're not going to be the way they were 50 years ago when social scientists were looking at the future. They couldn't have envisioned this, I don't think. So,
and change is the most difficult thing to accommodate.
Yeah.
Because it disrupts the social order that everybody depends upon in their daily lives. And a very small percentage of the total population anywhere is actually, what should I say, intellectual and ready to think innovatively about things as they change. And people always want to hold on to things as they are.
Mm-hmm.
So the forces of globalization really are problematic. And yet globalization is unstoppable.
It is that. So we'll probably should use that as a place to stop now. So, um, all right, Professor Spooner, we'll pick up on that point next week. All right.
Good. See you.
Thank you.
Bye.